By 4:30 on Thursday afternoon, the village hall at Flaxby Parva had acquired that faintly exhausted appearance common to places in which charitable intentions have recently been exercised. The folding chairs had been put away with more zeal than accuracy. The trestle tables stood naked and sticky under the windows, and the air carried a mixed odour of damp coats, tea leaves, and sponge cake of an aggressive lemon persuasion. It had been the Mother's Improvement Circle spring jumble sale, and though nobody would have claimed improvement on a large scale, the takings were thought respectable. Mrs. Pringle, who counted respectability in shillings, was still at the stage of adding the proceeds twice in order to feel the full moral benefit of them. Miss Vane, the librarian, was tying up a box of unsold annuals with the expression of one conferring burial rights. Near the door, the Reverend Mr. Quillam, who had come in search of a missing umbrella and remained from politeness, was saying that these events always strengthened the social fabric, though he said it with the caution of a man who had never fully trusted metaphor. The disturbance, when it came, was so little theatrical that at first nobody recognized it as one. It began with Miss Beatrice Lark, who had charge of the raffle book and most other things by natural right, looking up from a tray of cracked saucers and saying, "That is odd." There are sentences which, in certain places, have more arresting power than a cry. In Flaxby Parva, where one did not lightly surrender composure, "That is odd," caused 3 women to stop folding tablecloths, and the Reverend Quillam to replace a half-open umbrella in the stand without claiming it. "What is odd?" asked Mrs. Pringle. Miss Lark did not answer at once. She had a manner of gazing before speaking which gave the impression that other people's haste was one of the saddest features of modern life. She was looking through the glass panel of the side door that opened towards the narrow flagged passage behind the hall. A bicycle leaned against the wall outside, one of the black, dutiful machines ridden by men who disliked expenditure but approved of movement. On the ground, beside the bicycle, lay a bowler hat. A little beyond it, in the angle where the wall met the coal bunker, a man was sitting in a peculiarly slack fashion, his legs stretched out, his head bent forward, as though he had at last found a village committee meeting too much for him. "Oh dear," said Miss Vane. The Reverend Quillam moved first. Clergymen are often useful at the beginning of emergencies because everyone assumes they are accustomed to death, whereas in fact they are merely accustomed to speaking of it in improved language. He opened the door and stepped out into the passage, followed by Mrs. Pringle and Miss Lark, who had no intention whatever of being left behind on her own premises. The man by the coal bunker was Mr. Alistair Smeaton, Solicitor of Smeaton and Bell, High Street, Market Darnley. He acted for half the better sort of houses in the district and all the worse sorts of wills. He was a neat man in life, and even collapsed he preserved a professional air, as though he might presently apologize for inconveniencing everyone and request that no assumptions be drawn until the papers had been examined. The Reverend Quillam bent over him, then straightened with his usual air of having discovered a regrettable doctrinal nuance. "Well," said Mrs. Pringle. "I think," said the clergyman, "we should send for Dr. Fanshawe." Miss Lark, who believed in precision, said, "Do you mean he is dead?" The Reverend Quillam looked at Mr. Smeaton again, as if hoping the matter might have resolved itself in a more tactful direction. "I fear that may be the case." No one screamed. Flaxby Parva did not scream, not even when presented with excellent reasons. Mrs. Pringle said, "On the very afternoon of the jumble sale," in a tone that managed both indignation and martyrdom. Miss Vane, who had a romantic disposition kept under strict municipal control, pressed one hand to her brooch and whispered, "How dreadful!" Miss Lark crouched without fluttering and observed, "There is mud on his cuff." This was true. There was also a faint dark marking at the side of Mr. Smeaton's collar, though whether from soot, rain, or some more sinister agency could not at that moment be decided by ladies whose chief experience of stains had been domestic. Dr. Fanshawe arrived in 11 minutes. which was considered creditable given that his motor car had never fully accepted the existence of second gear. He came down the passage with his bag and his moustache set at a professional angle, examined the body briskly, and announced with an absence of embroidery that Mr. Smeaton had been dead for perhaps half an hour, perhaps a little less. "Heart?" asked the Reverend Quillam hopefully. Dr. Fanshawe gave him a look usually reserved for the less able members of the cottage hospital committee. Possibly. Possibly not. He has struck his head, though whether before or after collapse is another matter. Nobody is to move anything. I shall telephone the police. That word altered the atmosphere more than the body had done. Death in the abstract was sad and elevating. Police meant statements, and statements meant dates, times, and the possible betrayal of small, irrelevant foolishnesses. Mrs. Pringle immediately remembered that she had told Mr. Smeaton, not 2 weeks before, that his firm's bill for handling her sister's probate was positively metropolitan. Though this had seemed justified at the time, it now struck her as the kind of remark that would look bad in writing. Miss Vane remembered seeing him in animated conversation outside the post office on Tuesday evening with Mrs. Ember, whose husband had died in January, leaving several daughters, 3 guinea pigs, and, according to rumour, no entirely intelligible instructions. Miss Vane had not caught the words, but in village life this was not a permanent obstacle. Miss Lark remembered something else. Shortly before 3 o'clock, while pricing a box of brass curtain rings, she had seen Mr. Smeaton himself come through the gate at the side of the hall. He had not entered the sale, which was odd in a solicitor, since solicitors entered everything that might later require witnessing. Instead, he had paused in the passage with another man. Miss Lark had seen only part of that second figure through the glass, a dark overcoat, a hand in a suede glove, and the impatient movement of someone unaccustomed to waiting while lesser people arranged their consciences. "Who was it?" asked Dr. Fanshawe when she mentioned this. "I couldn't say." "Man or woman?" "Man, I think, though one does not like to be dogmatic with suede." The doctor stared at her. The Reverend Quillam looked pained but interested. By 5:15, the constable from Market Darnley had arrived, red-eared and important, and by 6, Inspector Purbright came out from the division. He was a long, fair man, with the calm face of one who had for years listened to villagers explain things in the wrong order and had ceased to regard this as malicious. His hat and coat suggested ordinary weather. His eyes suggested weather of a more changeable sort. He spoke first to Dr. Fanshawe, then to the constable, then to the assembled witnesses, who stood in an uneven row inside the hall as if waiting for marks out of 10. "A disagreeable business," he said pleasantly. "I'm sorry to trouble you after what seems to have been a strenuous afternoon." "It was very successful," said Mrs. Pringle automatically. "I'm delighted to hear it." This took a little wind from her. Purbright listened to each account without interruption, only once glancing through the side door panel towards the passage where Mr. Smeaton remained under a blanket, a shape both shocking and, after 20 minutes, curiously administrative. When Miss Lark described the unseen companion in the overcoat, the inspector nodded as if suede gloves were constantly defeating justice all over the county. "And Mr. Smeaton came here for what purpose?" he asked. Nobody knew. That, more than the body, produced the silence. It was an uncomfortable silence, not because it was empty, but because it was not. Every person in the room knew some small thing about Mr. Smeaton, or believed they did. The mortgages he had arranged, the estates he had untangled, the careful smile with which he listened to confidences and turned them into documents. A village solicitor heard much that was never spoken in church, and very little that was entirely innocent. Yet now, when a reason was wanted for his being in the narrow back passage of the hall at 3 o'clock on a Thursday, nobody could provide one that sounded fit to be said aloud. Purbright let the silence remain a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, with mild courtesy, "No doubt it will come to one of you shortly." He looked round the hall. Miss Vane dropped her eyes. Mrs. Pringle compressed her mouth. The Reverend Quillam studied the umbrella stand with theological concern, and Miss Lark, who feared neither facts nor their consequences, looked steadily back at him and thought that Inspector Purbright was the sort of man who heard more in a pause than most people heard in a speech. When the first statements had been taken, Purbright did not at once let the witnesses go, which disappointed Mrs. Pringle and alarmed the rest. Villagers preferred official matters to have edges. One was questioned, one answered, and one returned home to improve the story. Instead, the inspector moved among them with the same mild patience, as if he were sorting raffle tickets rather than a death. He asked Miss Vane exactly where she had seen Mr. Smeaton on Tuesday. He asked Mrs. Pringle what business had lately taken the solicitor to her house. He asked the Reverend Quillam whether Mr. Smeaton had seemed troubled in church on Sunday. The clergyman said most people seemed troubled in church, though not always by religion. Purbright accepted this and turned to Miss Lark. "You recognize the bicycle?" "Yes." "How?" "New bell, inferior tires. It squeaks when leaned to the left." "And the person with him?" "A man, I think." "Why only think?" "Because I saw a shoulder, a gloved hand, and the manner of a man. Women are often abrupt, but differently." The constable looked baffled. Purbright did not. Was Mr. Smeaton abrupt too? No. He was doing what professional men do when they dislike a conversation but mean to finish it. That was as near description as Miss Lark could bring herself to certainty. Purbright released them at last, requesting that they remain available and discuss the matter as little as possible. This was received in the spirit in which such requests generally are. Outside, the evening had thickened over Flaxby Parva. The body was removed. Dr. Fanshawe departed in offended silence. Purbright stayed for a few minutes in the narrow passage, looking at the coal bunker, the bicycle, and the flagstones. There had likely been a fall, and perhaps some brief struggle, but the place suggested argument rather than ambush. People did not come behind village halls to be murdered in comfort. They came there to avoid being seen. Sergeant Love arrived from Market Darnley as the hall clocks and private watches approached 7 in their various denominations of time. He joined Purbright at the trestle table where the dead man's papers had been spread. "There's money on him," said Love. "Watch as well, not robbery." No. There were letters, a diary, an account from the coal merchant, and a sealed envelope addressed to Mrs. Helena Grieve of the Cedars. In the diary, the 3 o'clock entry contained only the initials F, P, and a dash. "Flaxby Parva," said Love. "So one would suppose. Could mean he hadn't settled who he was meeting, or that he thought the other person would not bear writing down." Love disliked clues that depended on temperament. "Widow Grieve?" "The same. We may as well call tonight." Mrs. Helena Grieve received them in a drawing-room, lit too early by a silver lamp, and too deliberately by herself. She was a widow of the competent sort, whose grief had been arranged years ago and dusted regularly. Her niece, Clara, sat by the fire, with mending and the expression of a woman forever, on the point of either speaking honestly or being told not to. The news of Mr. Smeaton's death produced in Mrs. Grieve a stillness more striking than agitation. "He was here this morning," she said. "On business, madam. Solicitors seldom come otherwise." Purbright showed her the envelope. Her eyes paused on it, then moved away. "Yes, he brought that." "You have not opened it?" "No. He asked me not to, unless he returned later." "For what reason?" "He said he wished first to verify a recollection." Clara looked up from her mending. Aunt Helena thought something had been mislaid. Mrs. Grieve turned her head. "Clara." The single word contained a household history. Purbright said, "Miss Grieve may be right. Was something mislaid?" "Only a memorandum," said Clara before she could be prevented. Mr. Smeaton seemed vexed. He said he was sure he had once written down a name. "What name?" "I don't know." Mrs. Grieve set down her teacup. "Inspector, Mr. Smeaton came on a private family matter. He expected to meet someone later in the village." He was more irritable than usual, which in him meant tapping his umbrella. Before he left, he said, "I was a fool not to remember it sooner." Love shifted at that. Purbright merely asked, "Did he say what he had remembered?" "No." "Did he mention whom he was meeting?" "No." "Did he use your telephone?" "He asked to." "The line was poor," Clara said. "I heard him ask Market Darnley for a number, but the connection failed. Then he wrote something on his cuff with a pencil." "The left cuff?" asked Purbright. "I think so. He remembered the mud on the sleeve and said nothing of it. Instead, he asked whether Mr. Smeaton had visited earlier in the week." Mrs. Grieve answered too quickly. "No." Clara looked at her aunt, then at the inspector. Honesty and domestic loyalty met in her face, and, as often happened in such contests, honesty triumphed untidily. "He came on Monday," she said. "Only briefly. Aunt Helena was out." "Why did he call?" He asked whether Mr. Theo Bell had been here. Love looked up. Theo Bell was the junior partner's son, a young man with good tailoring, agreeable manners, and that expensive ease which suggested either income or carelessness. "And had he?" asked Purbright. "No," said Clara. "I told Mr. Smeaton so. He seemed disappointed, though perhaps relieved as well. It was hard to say." Mrs. Grieve said only, "Clara remembers in episodes." But Clara followed them into the hall. When he left, she said, Mr. Smeaton looked almost ashamed. He said, "If I am right, it will be unpleasant for everyone." "In the car," Love grunted. Purbright said, "Yes, a most unhelpful memory. It was beginning to behave like motive disguised as forgetfulness." By 9 o'clock next morning, the death of Mr. Alistair Smeaton had already settled into village usage. One theory gave him a weak heart and other people's strong demands upon it. Another, more decorative, supplied a secret meeting and disappointed affection. A third, favoured by Mrs. Pringle, because it combined thrift with virtue, declared that he had discovered something irregular about parish money and been disposed of for it. Flaxby Parva took breakfast with these explanations and felt, if not wiser, at least occupied. Purbright spent the morning in Market Darnley at the offices of Smeaton and Bell. Mr. Leonard Bell, senior partner, was away in Leicester. His son Theo, who occupied the front room with a new leather blotter and an old air of self-possession, received the inspector politely enough and looked as though civility were costing him money. "My father returns after luncheon," he said. "If this concerns poor Smeaton, I am not sure what I can add." "You can begin," said Purbright, "by telling me why Mr. Smeaton asked after you at the Cedars on Monday." Theo Bell, who had been lounging against the mantelpiece, altered the pose by half an inch. "Did he? So Miss Clara Grieve informs me. That is odd." "Yes," said Purbright. "Oddness has been plentiful." Bell smiled with effort. He was handsome in the agreeable modern way, carefully untidy where his father was carefully polished. Men distrusted him on principle. Women forgave him rather a lot. "I had not seen Mrs. Grieve," he said. "If Smeaton asked after me there, I suppose he meant some conveyancing matter." "When did you last see him?" "Yesterday, about 2:30. Love looked up. "At the office?" "For a few minutes." "Alone?" asked Purbright. Bell hesitated. "Not entirely. Miss Hardwick was in the outer office." Miss Hardwick proved to be a woman of exact spectacles and disciplined patience. She confirmed the time and added that Mr. Smeaton had come out of his room carrying a blue ledger under his arm. "Wills and settlements, I think," she said. "Think?" said Love. "I label the books," said Miss Hardwick. "I do not read the clients." Purbright asked Bell whether he knew which ledger it had been. Bell said he did not. Asked whether Smeaton had seemed disturbed, he replied that the dead man had been short with him over a valuation dispute connected with the Elton bequest. "In an office," Bell said, "people quarrel over string." Smeaton's room was orderly in that reproachful way by which solicitors suggest that chaos is for clients. Papers were stacked, drawers shut, pens aligned. On the desk, however, lay a clean oblong patch against the darker polish and, beside it, a faint smear of blue fibre. The shelf behind the desk held 6 ledgers and 1 clear gap. "What was there?" asked Purbright. Miss Hardwick looked at Bell. Bell looked at the window. "Family settlements," she said at last. "Private settlements, older matters, as well as recent alterations." "Whose families?" "A number. Name 3. Grieve, Elton, Warrender." At that, Theo Bell said sharply, "There is no reason to mention clients indiscriminately." Purbright turned to him. "No, only selectively." The telephone rang. Bell took it with too much gratitude, listened, said he was occupied, then went pale. "No, do not let him wait. I will come." He replaced the receiver and gave a brittle smile. "A client?" Purbright let him go. Miss Hardwick watched Bell leave with a look of old disapproval. "Mr. Theo Bell," she said, "has what his mother used to call social speed. He moves before he has a direction." "Did Mr. Smeaton trust him?" asked Love. "Mr. Smeaton trusted nobody under 40, said Miss Hardwick, "and only 2 over it." "Which 2? "Myself and a retired butcher in Bletchford who witnessed documents without conversation." She then admitted that Mrs. Ember from the post office had called the previous afternoon about her late husband's estate and left upset because Smeaton was unavailable. More reluctantly, she added that the Reverend Quillam had telephoned shortly before 2, asking if Smeaton still meant to see him about a parish boundary question. He had been told yes. "But he never went?" said Love. "Not as far as I know." Purbright thanked her and went out with the sergeant into the market street, where carts and motor cars moved around one another with deliberate rural uncertainty. Bell quarrelled with him. "The ledger is missing, and the dead man was hunting an unpleasant memory," said Love. "That is enough to keep a man awake." Purbright looked back at the frosted door. Through it, Bell's shadow crossed quickly, then vanished. "Yes," he said, "but I am not yet sure who is being protected by that missing book." On their way to the car, they passed Martin Ember's former stationer's shop, now managed with strained competence by his widow. In the window stood children's slates, mourning paper, envelopes, and 1 large ledger bound in blue cloth. Love paused. "Common enough colour," he said. "Quite," said Purbright. Yet Mrs. Ember, seeing them from behind the counter, went so suddenly still that even through the glass her alarm seemed to ask admission. Purbright opened the door, and the bell above it gave a clang. Mrs. Ember came forward with the briskness of a woman to arrive before suspicion did. She was pale and laced into widowhood. "Good morning, Inspector. Can I help you?" "I hope so," said Purbright, glancing at the ledger in the window. "That book is not for sale, I think." Her hand moved at once to the edge of the counter. "No, it is only part of the display." "Where did it come from?" "My husband's stock." Love said nothing. Purbright waited. Under waiting, Mrs. Ember's command thinned. At last, she said, with care, "If this is about Mr. Smeaton, I would rather speak in private." When they were in the parlour behind the shop, Mrs. Ember shut the door, not with secrecy exactly, but with the care of a woman who had spent 3 months discovering how quickly privacy could be spent by others. "That ledger in the window is not from my husband's stock," she said. "Mr. Smeaton brought it to me on Tuesday and asked me to keep it where Mr. Bell would not see it." Love said, "Why to you?" "Because Martin used to do small jobs for him. Nothing improper. Lists copied, rents entered, old books mended. Mr. Smeaton said if anyone asked, it was merely part of the display. I did not like it, but he was insistent." Purbright looked at the ledger through the open parlour door. It was the right size, the right fading blue, and altogether too conveniently visible for a thing that had been hidden. "Did he tell you what was in it?" "No. Only that it should be safe until he came back from Flaxby. He did not come back." "And Bell?" asked Purbright. He called yesterday morning. He wanted a blank ledger, blue if possible. He said his father preferred that color for household accounts. I thought nothing of it then, but when I heard of Mr. Smeaton, she allowed the sentence to trail away into widowhood. If there is some significance, I would rather the village did not have it before supper. There was. Purbright asked to see the book. On the flyleaf, beneath the stationer's printed crest, a name had once been written and then rubbed almost away. The last letters remained, Render. On one of the earlier pages, several leaves had been cut out so neatly that the gap showed only when the book was held against the light. Love gave a satisfied little breath. Mrs. Ember looked offended by the evidence, as respectable people always did when facts behaved with professional confidence in their own sitting rooms. I am due at the Laurels at 4, she said. Mrs. Warrender asked me to bring tea things and go over some household bills. If you mean to ask questions there, I would prefer not to arrive looking as though I had earned commission. Purbright said he had no wish to deprive her of innocence if it could be preserved. By 3:30, he and Love were driving up the Laurels Lane, behind hedges that had long ago decided on permanence and no longer pretended to be trimmed. The house belonged to Mrs. Sybil Warrender, whose family had once possessed land in a quantity sufficient to make them dull without effort. Time had diminished the acreage but not the habits. Tea at the Laurels was served by a maid who disapproved of modern life in silence and of policemen in profile. Mrs. Warrender herself sat upright among faded roses and silver frames, like a commander who had survived the loss of territory by refusing to acknowledge maps. Beside her was Miss Dora Peaslake, companion and keeper of opinions. Mrs. Ember arrived a minute later with a cake tin and relief disguised as duty. "I am told," said Mrs. Warrender, before anyone had properly sat down, "that poor Mr. Smeaton has managed to die in a passage. It sounds unsatisfactory. He always disliked confined arrangements." Purbright accepted tea in the remark. "You knew him well, madam?" "For 30 years. He did my husband's papers, my nephew's disentanglements, and a number of things which ought never to have required legal assistance if men were not born with appetites." "Did he discuss an old ledger with you?" Something moved across Miss Peaslake's face and shut itself in again. Mrs. Warrender put down her cup. "He asked whether I still kept the old household accounts from before the war. I said no. Dora said perhaps. Between us, that usually means yes." Miss Peaslake said, "He was in a peculiar state. He kept asking whether my memory of the year 1949 was exact. I told him memory is never exact when men begin asking after it." "Why 1949? asked Love. "Because," said Mrs. Warrender, with a dryness that invited no weather, "my husband chose that year to make a settlement which pleased no one and surprised nobody. Mr. Smeaton had drafted it. He lately believed that someone else had seen a memorandum connected with it, and that the household accounts might show who was in the house at the time." Mrs. Ember, who had been pouring from habit rather than attention, let the teapot strike the tray. "Then Mr. Bell was there," she said. The room altered by a fraction. Miss Peaslake looked at her. Mrs. Warrender looked at the window. Purbright looked at nobody. "What Bell?" asked Love. "The elder one was dead by then," said Mrs. Ember. "But young Theo came with his mother that autumn. I remember because Martin sent over 2 new account books, and Mr. Theo blotted his name in one of them. He was a boy, but vain enough to sign things." Miss Peaslake said, "That is perfectly true." She seemed annoyed by truth, as some people are when it arrives from the wrong side of the room. "His mother stayed a week. The child wandered everywhere," Purbright said, "and the memorandum Mr. Smeaton wanted to identify concerned that visit." Mrs. Warrender gave him a level look. "Inspector, I have no notion what it concerned, but if Alistair Smeaton suddenly recovered a conscience after 27 years, it was bound to inconvenience someone." Then the maid returned, and beneath the tea trolley lay a torn blue page, folded once, and half hidden under one wheel, waiting for notice. The maid bent for the cake plates, and Purbright, moving with a courtesy that made interference resemble assistance, stooped before she could touch the paper. It was a single leaf, folded once, the torn edge showing the blue threads of the binding. For a moment, nobody spoke. Mrs. Warrender's hand rested on the arm of her chair with rather too much intention. Miss Peaslake, who had been on the verge of saying something crisp to the maid, now said nothing at all. Only Mrs. Ember, standing with the teapot, gave the little breath of a person who sees somebody else's secret become communal property. "May I?" said Purbright, though he already had it. The page had been torn from an account book, but not, as Love first supposed, from the recent household records. The ink was browned with age. Across the top, in a round, careful hand, stood October 1949. Below were entries for coal, lamp oil, butcher, and a sum paid to Bell and Bell, solicitors. Beneath those, written later in pencil and in a sharper hand, were the words, Mrs. L. Bell arrived with son, Miss Grieve, in morning room. A. S. to library, 3.15. Memorandum corrected. Love looked at Theo Bell's mother and son with professional interest, despite neither of them being in the room. "Well," he said. Mrs. Warrender said, "You will not make that noise in my drawing-room, Sergeant. It suggests triumph, and there is very little to be triumphant about." Purbright refolded the page. "How did it come to be under the trolley?" Miss Peaslake answered. "It was in a cookbook in the breakfast room. I found it after luncheon." "And brought it here?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because Sybil dislikes surprises at tea." It was not, in itself, an explanation, but it had the shape of one within the house. Mrs. Warrender regarded her companion with an expression of old endurance. Dora means she did not wish the servants to see it first. They are loyal, but they are also broad-minded in the matter of distribution. I had told her yesterday to search the old receipt books, because Mr. Smeaton's questions had become tiresome. "You expected to find this page?" "I expected, Dora, to find anything that could be called inconvenient." Miss Peaslake drew herself up. "If you imply concealment, Inspector, I must tell you that concealment in country houses has often been merely another word for housekeeping." "Quite," said Purbright. "What was the memorandum that had been corrected?" Neither lady answered at once. Then, surprisingly, they spoke together. "We do not know. This agreement, arriving from two women who had spent 20 years improving each other by contradiction, had more effect than denial." Love stared. Mrs. Ember found herself a chair without being invited. Purbright said mildly, "That is very nearly convincing." Mrs. Warrender permitted herself the ghost of a smile. "It ought to be, it is true." Miss Peaslake added, "We know only that some note was altered after Mrs. Bell and the boy arrived." Alistair Smeaton came to the house that afternoon. Helena Grieve was here because her brother had brought her over. She was not then the alarming widow she has since become. She was merely a nervous girl with excellent gloves. "And Theo Bell?" asked Love. "A child underfoot," said Mrs. Warrender. "A child with ears," said Miss Peaslake. Purbright slipped the page into his notebook. Mr. Smeaton told Mrs. Grieve he had failed to remember a name. Now, it appears he had remembered an arrangement, a time, and a correction. What sort of correction would require a memorandum? "Legal sort, no doubt," said Mrs. Warrender. "Social sort," said Miss Peaslake at the same moment. They exchanged a brief look, not friendly, not hostile, but united by the depressing necessity of accuracy. "That," said Purbright, "is better." Miss Peaslake leaned forward. "If you insist upon knowing, there was talk then of Helena's possible engagement to Gerald Warrender, Sybil's nephew. It came to nothing." Mrs. Warrender said, "Because Gerald was a fool." "And because," said Miss Peaslake, "someone wished it to come to nothing." Mrs. Ember, who had nearly succeeded in becoming part of the upholstery, now said, Mrs. Bell might have wished it. She had ambitions. Mrs. Warrender's eyebrows rose a fraction. Most women do. Few are vulgar enough to let them show. Did Mrs. Bell want her son to marry Miss Grieve? Asked Love. Not at 12, said Miss Peaslake. But she wanted access, influence, invitations, and the right to speak familiarly where she ought to have spoken gratefully. She was not liked. By you? Said Purbright. By any woman with standards. Mrs. Warrender said, Dora is right. Laura Bell was charming to men and acquisitive to wallpaper. One could hardly blame Helena's brother for growing suspicious. That would be Mr. Frederick Grieve? Yes. Dead now, which is like him. He was never helpful for long. There it was again, Helena Grieve, Theo Bell. A correction, an old suspicion revived. Yet the page told less than it appeared to. It placed people in rooms, but not their minds in motives. Purbright rose. I should like a word with Miss Grieve. Mrs. Warrender said, You may have several. She has inherited silence from one side of the family and frankness from the other, and they keep alternating. At the door, Miss Peaslake followed him into the hall. Her severe face had acquired the embarrassment of a person doing something generous against habit. Inspector, she said quietly, Sybil and I do know one thing. If Alistair Smeaton meant to repair an old wrong, he would not have been doing it for money. No? He had already had the money, if money there was. That is why he looked ashamed. When Purbright and Love reached the car, the sergeant said, Bell's mother, Helena Grieve. Old settlements, missing pages. It still comes back to Bell. Yes, said Purbright, rather too neatly. At the gate, Clara Grieve appeared in haste, carrying the envelope from the Cedars, and looking at Purbright as if late. Clara Grieve had come quickly enough to lose the look of deliberation and acquire that of accident, which deceived nobody. She held out the sealed envelope as if it were a summons. Aunt Helena says you had better open it now, she said. She has spent the last hour deciding that privacy is noble, and the next deciding it is impractical. Purbright took the envelope. The paper was thick, old-fashioned, and sealed with the sort of care by which solicitors rebuke the world for being disorderly. Mrs. Helena Grieve's name stood across the front, but in one corner, almost as an afterthought, Mr. Smeaton had penciled, If anything occurs before my return, show this to Inspector Purbright. Love gave a grunt of satisfaction. Clara said, I told Aunt Helena that if a dead man writes in pencil, one ought not to argue with him. Inside was a single sheet in Smeaton's cramped hand. It contained no explanation, only 3 names, H, Grieve, T, Bell, Rev. Quillam, followed by the words, Ask who knew of the correction. Not the memorandum, the correction. Love frowned. That is clear as mud after rain. Purbright folded the paper again. It is a little clearer than that. Mr. Smeaton thought we should ask the wrong question. Clara, who had been watching him with an anxiety made more conspicuous by self-command, said, What is the right one? He has just told us. Love said, Then why include Quillam? The parson was talking about boundaries. Perhaps because people often talk about boundaries when they mean trespass. Clara said quietly, If you are going to the rectory, I am walking that way. The statement did not invite objection. Mrs. Warrender's gate shut behind them, and the 3 set off along the lane under laurels that kept their own counsel and everybody else's damp. The evening was drawing in with the unconvincing gentleness of early spring. From one field came the slow complaint of sheep. From another, the metallic sound of a boy attempting something agricultural with a bicycle. Clara walked between Purbright and Love for a little, then dropped half a pace behind the sergeant, as if proximity to official shoulders might delay whatever came next. At last she said, When my aunt heard Mr. Smeaton was dead, she did not seem surprised. Shocked, yes, but not surprised. That sounds heartless. It is not. Then what is it? Asked Purbright. She had expected something disagreeable. He had been coming too often. About the old settlement? Yes, and about my Uncle Frederick. He died 3 years ago, but Mr. Smeaton lately behaved as though Uncle Frederick had hidden a reproach somewhere among the furniture and he meant to find it before anyone else did. Love said, "Did your uncle quarrel with Bell?" "With Mr. Leonard Bell, no. With Laura Bell, certainly. With Theo, not really. Theo was younger than I was and very eager to overhear adults. Uncle Frederick said it was a social gift that would make him either successful or unbearable." "And which did he become?" asked Purbright. Clara almost smiled. "That depends whom you ask." At the bend by the rectory wall, they encountered Miss Lark returning from the post-box with a parcel tied in such a severe fashion that it seemed already censured. She greeted Purbright without surprise, and Clara with a glance that combined sympathy and inquiry. "I have just seen Mrs. Pringle," she said. "She believes the entire matter hinges on church funds." "Does she?" said Purbright. "Yes. She is disappointed that no embezzlement has yet emerged." Love's face twitched. Miss Lark lowered her voice. "Also, the Reverend Quillam has a caller." "Who?" "Mr. Theo Bell. He went in 10 minutes ago and not in the mood for pastoral relief." That altered the direction of all 3 minds, without altering their pace. Purbright merely thanked her, and they continued along the wall to the rectory gate. Through the study window a lamp was lit, and across the blind there moved, first, the unmistakable silhouette of the Reverend Quillam, narrow and clerical, and second, the more emphatic outline of a younger man whose gestures suggested that self-control had been recommended to him by others, but never adopted. The maid who answered the bell was flurried before she had opened her mouth. "Mr. Bell is with the vicar," she said. "I'm not sure." Purbright saved her from uncertainty by stepping into the hall. Voices from the study had already become sufficiently distinct. "I only asked what Smeaton said," Theo Bell was saying. "There is no cause to make a confession out of curiosity." "And there is no cause," replied Quillam, with a firmness rarely heard from him outside liturgy, "to call at my house in the dark and demand the contents of private conversation." Purbright opened the study door. Theo Bell turned at once. Good looks deserted some men in surprise. Bell's stayed, but became harder, as if built for weather. "Inspector," he said, "I didn't hear you." "No, you were improving the acoustics." Bell gave a short laugh that asked not to be examined. "I've nothing to hide." "No one says that gracefully," said Purbright. Quillam sat, perhaps from gratitude. He admitted that he had indeed telephoned Smeaton shortly before 2, but not about a boundary after all. The boundary existed. It had merely been useful. What he had truly wished to discuss was a conversation the solicitor had had with him the previous evening after choir practice, when the church was empty but for dust and hymn books. Frederick once hinted a document had been altered, Quillam said. Not forged, corrected. Mrs. Bell knew it, and Smeaton feared Bell's son had learned enough to profit by it. Bell's colour changed. Clara, unseen in the doorway, said quietly, "Aunt Helena knows that as well." Clara's voice, quiet though it was, had the effect of a dropped glass. Theo Bell turned toward her, and since Purbright had entered the rectory, his confidence had not appeared diminished until now, but displaced, as if he had found himself standing inside somebody else's quarrel. The Reverend Quillam removed his spectacles and polished them with unnecessary devotion. "Knows what, exactly?" Bell asked. Clara stepped into the study. "That my Uncle Frederick believed a paper had been altered years ago, and that Mr. Smeaton feared the alteration might be used." "Used by whom?" he said. Clara gave him the look women reserve for men who insist on discussing the umbrella while the house burns. "You have been asking that question too often for it to sound innocent." Bell coloured, though anger kept pace with it. "If Helena Grieve has filled your head with legends, I cannot help that. My mother knew everybody's business because people told it to her." "That is not the same as falsifying documents," Purbright said mildly. "No, but it is the same as benefiting from them." Quillam replaced his spectacles and said, with the air of a man stepping between carts. Mr. Bell came to ask what Mr. Smeaton had said to me. He was importunate, but not violent. Bell gave the clergyman a glance, made harder by gratitude. I came because Smeaton was disturbed yesterday. He told me there was an error about to become a scandal. When a man says that and is dead an hour later, curiosity is quite natural. Curiosity, said Purbright, becomes unattractive when it arrives after dark and without invitation. Purbright asked Bell to remain, while Clara took Quillam's sherry tray away, an errand so transparent that even Love respected it. Left with the men, the inspector inquired when Bell had last seen the missing blue ledger. Bell replied, after a pause large enough to require furniture. On Monday. Smeaton had it open in his room. He shut it when I came in. And yesterday? I assumed it was where it always was. You assumed many things, said Love. People do, Bell returned, until someone dies and assumptions become evidence. That was as far as Bell would go. Pride and caution had joined forces, and the alliance suited him. Purbright let him leave, which disturbed Love more than detaining him would have done. In the hall, Clara was waiting with the empty tray and an expression of modest guilt. Quillam, relieved of Bell's presence, said, Smeaton asked me yesterday whether kindness could become a form of lying. Purbright said, And what answer did you give? That most civilized households depend upon it. He seemed less shocked than confirmed by it. Outside again, the night had sharpened. Clara chose to walk home rather than ride in the police car, and Purbright walked with her as far as the Cedars Gate, while Love went on to telephone Market Darnley. She spoke more easily in darkness, perhaps because villages cannot listen through hedges after dusk. My aunt was kind to Laura Bell, she said. Laura had debts and had written foolish letters to Gerald Warrender before she married. Aunt Helena found them and gave them back. She told nobody, not even Uncle Frederick. Why? Purbright asked. Clara opened the gate and then closed it again without entering. Because Laura cried. Because Aunt Helena thought mercy was superior to justice. Uncle Frederick discovered something later and never forgave either of them, though I am not sure he knew what. He said kindness sends a bill. Purbright considered that. Did Mr. Smeaton know about the letters? I believe so. Laura consulted him before her marriage. Aunt Helena thought he had destroyed them. Uncle Frederick thought he had kept copies. That was their quarrel with him. At the Cedars door, she paused again. Inspector, Theo Bell may be vain, selfish, and too ready to arrive where he is not wanted, but he is not like his mother. He does not store people's weaknesses for future use, Purbright said. That is charitable. Clara gave a tired shrug. It is accurate. Theo prefers advantages that can be worn in daylight. After she had gone in, Purbright remained by the yew hedge, considering that innocence described with reluctance was often worth more than protest. Then Love returned with news. A message had come from Market Darnley. Leonard Bell had returned and wished to speak before rumours grew imaginative. They found him in his office, grey, dry, and better dressed than grief required. He listened to the account of Theo's visit to the rectory without surprise. My son has inherited his mother's fatal belief, he said, that if one knows a thing first, one controls it. When Purbright asked about Laura Bell's letters, the older man closed a drawer, though there had been no need. So that is walking again. Leonard Bell admitted his wife had once written indiscreetly to Gerald Warrender, and that Helena Grieve, finding the letters, had returned them to preserve a marriage not yet made. Frederick Grieve believed Smeaton kept copies, he said. He believed Laura persuaded Smeaton to alter a note connected with Helena's settlement, so Gerald would think her fortune smaller and withdraw. It sounds melodramatic because it was. Gerald withdrew because he was weak. And the correction? Asked Purbright. Bell's mouth stiffened. That I never learned. Laura said that kindness had been costly. It was nearly midnight when Purbright left the office. The market square had emptied, leaving lamps and one newspaper blowing around a drain. Love said, "If everyone spared everyone else, somebody has been living on mercy at compound interest." Purbright nodded. Through Bell's blind, they could see the older man motionless at his desk. Stillness suited solicitors even less than candor. "Yes," said the inspector, and Smeaton's last concern was not the altered note, but the person who knew it had been altered. "Tomorrow we shall look in the vestry." The vestry at St. Anselm's had the chill particular to rooms in which piety was stored rather than practiced. On Friday morning it smelled of hassocks, candle grease, and old wool, with an undertone of damp stone that no quantity of hymn-singing had ever quite persuaded into sanctity. Purbright arrived before 9, when the church itself was still empty except for Mrs. Borridge, who dusted memorial tablets with the proprietary severity of one who believed the dead should continue to present themselves properly. She gave him a look suggesting that policemen, like Ivy, ought not to be encouraged on ecclesiastical property, then admitted that the Reverend Quillam had left instructions for the vestry books to be shown. Those books, when produced from a walnut cupboard, were less impressive than their importance. One contained baptismal notes, another petty cash, a third church warden's observations, so full of underlinings and indignation that Love, turning its pages, murmured that religion clearly had its excitements. Purbright asked instead, for whatever loose memoranda Mr. Quillam kept after meetings, funerals, parish teas, and the innumerable occasions upon which somebody mentioned a matter that could not possibly be dealt with at once, but must not be forgotten. Mrs. Borridge sniffed, which in her amounted to endorsement, and produced a shallow drawer of envelopes, visiting cards, and folded slips held together by a bootlace. Among them lay several notes in Smeaton's hand, all written within the last fortnight, each brisk, elusive, and unsatisfactory. One asked whether the parish copy of the Warrender marriage settlement had ever been lent out. Another requested the date on which Mrs. Bell had stood sponsor to an infant nephew, a pious act nobody now living had thought worth connecting to anything. A third, undated, simply read, "Did Frederick say who heard Laura in the vestry? If Quillam remembers, say nothing by telephone." Love whistled, softly enough to preserve doctrine. So there was a scene in the vestry already, or a conversation afterwards, called a scene by someone who regretted it, said Purbright. Quillam, arriving just then in a coat too thin for his office and his weather, heard the last words and looked distressed. "I have regretted many conversations in vestries," he said. "They encourage candor because nobody expects it there." Pressed gently, he admitted that on Monday evening, after choir practice, Helena Grieve had spoken sharply to him outside the vestry door, while Theo Bell waited in the porch, pretending interest in a missionary leaflet. She had asked whether old parish papers could be inspected without public notice. Bell, hearing this, had laughed and remarked that private histories were becoming fashionable. Mr. Quillam, disliking both the topic and Bell's tone, had sent them away separately. Later that same evening, Smeaton had come by, wanting to know exactly what Bell had overheard. "Did you tell him?" "I told him Bell had heard too much to be harmless and too little to be useful." "That is a narrow strip of ground," said Purbright. "Most mischief occupies it." There remained the question of Laura Bell in the vestry, and on this Quillam's memory grew clerical. He had not been vicar then, only curate. He recalled a christening, rain on the south windows, and Laura Bell crying in a manner intended to suggest delicacy rather than temper. Helena Grieve had been present. So, unexpectedly, had Miss Dora Peaslake, then visiting the Warrenders, and capable, even in youth, of appearing wherever other people wished her absent. The matter, Quillam said, had been domestic, which in parish language could denote anything from adultery to flower rotors. Purbright asked for the old vestry attendance books. Mrs. Borridge found them after a hunt conducted with the moral fervour of a woman, proving that disorder was always somebody else's fault. In the book for October 1949, on a page listing supplies for the harvest decorations, one line had been struck through so carefully that the ink itself seemed embarrassed beneath Mrs. Bell candles. Someone had first written meeting after service, then altered it to spoke with Mrs. G. The second phrase matched Smeaton's cramped correction hand almost exactly, Love said. So Smeaton altered the parish note himself. Yes, said Purbright. Years later, by the look of it. Quillam stared at the page, as though it had become doctrinal without permission. Why would he do that? To make a private quarrel look less like a meeting and more like conversation. To soften it. Purbright closed the book, and to protect one woman from another. Mrs. Borridge, who liked explanations plain, said, "That would be kindness, then." "It would be," said Purbright, "if kindness had stopped there." He took the books with Quillam's consent and went out into the churchyard, where Love, catching up beside him, said what both were thinking. Helena Grieve asks about parish papers. Bell overhears. Smeaton panics. And before long he is dead. It is still Bell. Purbright looked across the graves to the lane. Miss Peaslake was coming through the lick gate with the unmistakable tread of a woman who had set out to prevent error at source. "Possibly," he said. "But Bell is asking after scandal. Someone else has spent 27 years tidying it." Miss Peaslake reached them, breathless only in principle. "If you have found the vestry note," she said, "you must also know Helena did not begin this search for herself." Purbright waited. "Laura Bell wrote to her last month." Miss Peaslake went on. "Not for money, for mercy. She is dying in Bath, and Theo does not know why she once begged Helena to say she had met no one after service." Love stared. "No one? No one important," said Miss Peaslake. "That was the lie. Helena saw whom she met. So did Smeaton. And now Helena has gone to Bath this morning without telling Clara or anyone." Miss Peaslake's announcement did not produce alarm so much as a rearrangement of everybody's suspicions. Helena Grieve had left for Bath that morning, Laura Bell lay dying there, and Mr. Smeaton had been killed the previous afternoon after speaking of an old correction. The matter, which had so far seemed crowded with names, now became crowded with hours. Love swore mildly beneath his breath. Purbright did not rebuke him. He was looking past the churchyard wall towards the road to Market Darnley, as though the answer might already be travelling upon it by bus, by bicycle, or by the slower vehicle of recollection. "Was she expected in Bath?" he asked. Miss Peaslake said, "Only by Laura Bell, I imagine. Helena told nobody here. She telephoned from Sybil's morning room after breakfast, then went up to pack." "Did she say when she would return?" "No. Helena never returns at a time. She returns in a manner. Love said, 'Clara will take this badly.'" "Clara," said Miss Peaslake, "takes truth badly only when it has been delayed." They found Clara exactly where Miss Peaslake had feared, standing in the hall at the Cedars with her gloves still on and the expression of a woman who had been left behind by an explanation. She listened without interruption while Purbright told her of her aunt's departure. When he mentioned Bath, she went pale, but not, he thought, from surprise alone. "She had a letter yesterday morning," Clara said. "I assumed it was from some cousin in Cheltenham who writes in crises. She burned it after luncheon." "Before or after?" Theo Bell called. "After. He had not come to the house, but he telephoned." "Did your aunt speak to him?" "Yes, briefly. She said, 'No, not now,' and hung up." Love asked whether Helena had gone by train. Clara said she believed so, and within half an hour they had confirmed at Market Darnley station that Mrs. Grieve had taken the 10:21 to Bath, carrying a small case and travelling without maid, which impressed the booking clerk more than the destination. He also remembered something else. A gentleman had been on the platform to see her off, though he had not bought a ticket, tall, fair, in a dark coat. "Theo Bell?" said Love. The clerk frowned with the conscientious uncertainty of public service. "Could be, or a vicar with ambitions." Purbright thanked him and asked no more. Back in the car, Love said, if Bell saw her off, he knew where she was going before anyone else. Perhaps. And if he did not, someone wants us to think he did. Purbright drove in silence through the noon traffic of carts, dogs, and purposeful women. At the corner by the post office, he stopped suddenly. "Mrs. Ember," he said. "Smeaton left the ledger with her on Tuesday." "Why then? Why not before?" Love considered. Because he only realized on Tuesday that the old correction mattered. No, because on Tuesday someone else realized it mattered. Smeaton hid the ledger after he was asked for it. Bell? Possibly, but ask yourself who had just received a letter from Bath. Laura Bell's lodging house in Bath, when reached by telephone after several failures and one interruption by a gentleman wanting the fishmonger, produced a nurse with the voice of a woman who had no time for mysteries but a little too much experience of them. Mrs. Laura Bell was alive, weak, and not to be distressed. Mrs. Helena Grieve had indeed arrived just after 1 o'clock. No, she was not expected by name, though a visit had been asked for. Yes, there had been another caller earlier in the week, a gentleman from London or perhaps Bristol. No, not Mr. Bell. Younger than that. Pleasant, restless. He had left before lunch on Thursday. "Younger than Leonard Bell," said Love. "That still leaves Theo." It does. Yet Purbright did not sound satisfied. The call to Bath had clarified Helena's movements without resolving the more troublesome question of Thursday afternoon. If Laura Bell had summoned mercy at last, why had Smeaton gone to Flaxby before Helena could leave? And why had he written Quillam's name beside hers and Bell's, unless the answer depended not on the letter itself, but on who learned of it and when? At 2 o'clock he walked alone from the station road to the lane behind the village hall, tracing the dead man's probable route. At the side gate he paused. From there one could see the rectory path, the back of the Cedars orchard, and, if someone stood carelessly, the post office window. Miss Lark, emerging from the hall with 2 account books and a moral objection to disorder, found him there. She was not surprised. She believed inspectors, like mildew, could generally be expected where trouble had once settled. "You are looking for a line of sight," she said. "Yes." "Then you should stand 3 feet to the left. Mrs. Pringle did yesterday, and saw Mrs. Ember cross from the post office at 20 to 3. "Coming here?" "No. Going towards the rectory, carrying a parcel. She came back without it 5 minutes later." "Did she meet anyone?" "Not in the lane." But Theo Bell's motor car was outside the post office at the time, which Mrs. Pringle mentioned with relish and no chronology. Purbright thanked her and went to the rectory, where Quillam, after resistance to memory, admitted that Mrs. Ember had brought him a parcel that afternoon, a blue ledger. She said Smeaton had asked him to keep it until evening. Bell had not been present, but from the window Quillam had seen Bell's car draw away from the office just as Smeaton entered the hall gate on foot. The 2 men could not have missed one another. "And Mrs. Ember?" asked Purbright. Quillam looked miserable. She said she was helpful. Purbright nodded. "That," he said, "is what worries me." Then the telephone in the hall rang, and Quillam answered it with a face that changed before he spoke. "Inspector," he said, "it is Bath. Mrs. Bell is asking for Theo." Purbright took the call himself. Laura Bell's voice, relayed from Bath through the rectory telephone, was thin but governed. She asked first for Theo, then, when told he was not there, for Inspector Purbright. The change in her tone was slight and brave. "I have not much time for explanations," she said, "only enough for one correction. Theo must not suppose Helena Grieve sought me out. I sent for her. Alistair knew why." "Why, Mrs. Bell?" There was a pause, filled by distant clatter and the nurse's shoes. because I was tired of being forgiven for the wrong thing. Then the line failed. Love, listening beside him, said, "That is almost art." "No," said Purbright. "It is confession, with details removed." They found Theo Bell in his office, not working and not pretending convincingly. He looked at their faces and abandoned the blotter for once. "She telephoned here as well," he said. "The nurse said I was to go to Bath tonight." "You went earlier in the week," said Purbright. Bell did not immediately answer. He went to the window, then came back from it with the same rehearsed quality his movements had shown for 2 days. "On Thursday morning," he said. "My mother wrote on Tuesday. The letter reached me late. She said there was an old kindness I had mistaken for greed, and that if Helena Grieve came, matters might be put right before she died. I drove to Bath and saw her for 20 minutes. And? She would not tell me plainly. She said I was not Leonard Bell's son in the way I had always imagined." Love gave a small, involuntary movement. Bell saw it and laughed once, without humor. "Yes. Precisely that sort of sentence. She said my life had been arranged by decent people, and one indecent one, and that Smeaton knew which was which. Then she became exhausted and ordered me out." Purbright said, "So you came back and went straight to Smeaton?" "Yes." He denied nothing, explained nothing, and told me to leave old scandals to old women. I asked whether Helena Grieve knew. He said she knew enough to despise him. That was when I went to Quilham. I thought if the village had kept some parish record of the thing, I might at least force the truth into daylight. "Instead," said Purbright, "you spent 2 days looking like a guilty man." Bell's face hardened. "If you discover at 30 that your father may have been selected by committee, you do not at once acquire ease." The crude phrase, because it concealed injury so badly, carried conviction. Purbright asked where Bell had been between 2:30 and 3 on Thursday. Bell answered at once now. He had left the office, driven to the post office to telephone Bath, found the line engaged, and seen Mrs. Ember crossing with a parcel. He then drove out towards Bletchford, turned back near the mill, and only later heard of Smeaton's death. "Why lie before?" asked Love. "Because every answer seemed to make me sound either sordid or theatrical." "Those are not mutually exclusive," said Purbright. From Bell's office they went directly to Mrs. Ember, who received them in the back parlour with the weariness of a woman who had discovered helpfulness was not, after all, private. At first she maintained that Smeaton had asked her to take the ledger to Quilham. Faced with Bell's account and Purbright's silence, she gave way. "It was Mrs. Grieve," she said. "She came in by the side door just after Bell had telephoned. She had a dark coat on and gloves. She asked whether the blue ledger was still with me. I said yes. She said Mr. Smeaton had become confused and that the rector was the proper place for legal books in a moral emergency. It sounded absurd, but like something said under strain. I took it over myself because she seemed near fainting. Did she say where she was going?" Mrs. Ember looked at the tabletop. "To meet him. She said if Alistair meant to drag the dead into daylight, he could at least do it speaking to the living first." That sent Love into a short burst of satisfaction, quickly checked by Purbright's expression. "You think she killed him?" said the sergeant, as they walked back to the car. "I think," said Purbright, "that she was there." "And the rest?" "The rest is the least comfortable explanation." By evening he had it almost complete. Laura Bell, long ago, had begged Helena Grieve to conceal not a theft of money but a more expensive disorder. Theo Bell was Smeaton's son. Leonard Bell had known before the marriage, Laura after it, and Helena. Frederick Grieve had suspected enough to become bitter, and Smeaton, in a fit of cowardly kindness, had altered notes, softened memoranda, and helped respectable people misdescribe the truth until the truth grew claws. Now Laura, dying, wanted Theo told. Helena wanted first to spare him the ugliest part, that Smeaton had known, hidden it, and gone on dining with them all. It explained Smeaton's shame, Laura's plea, Bell's agitation, and Helena's haste. It did not, by itself, explain death. Yet Purbright thought it came near. A woman like Helena Grieve, who had spent half a lifetime preserving other people's dignity at the expense of frankness, might perfectly well ask for delay. A man like Smeaton, frightened at last of being remembered accurately, might refuse. In a narrow passage, beside a coal bunker, with old loyalties and new humiliations pressing in, a refusal could become a movement, a fall, and a fall a death too final for anyone's intention. What remained was not proof but mercy. For that, Purbright thought, one would have to assemble the right people and let society do what force could not, make confession more bearable than concealment. Purbright did not summon anyone to the station. Stations encouraged denial. Instead, on Saturday afternoon, he asked Mrs. Warrender whether she would lend her drawing room for an hour to several persons who would rather be elsewhere. Mrs. Warrender, who considered social discomfort one of civilization's last useful instruments, agreed at once. By 4 o'clock, the room at the Laurels contained Helena Grieve, newly returned from Bath. Clara beside her. Theo and Leonard Bell sat at a distance from one another that was familial rather than polite. Miss Peaslake alert. Mrs. Ember in her black gloves. The Reverend Quillam wishing that matters might become pastoral, and love near the window. Tea had been neglected by everyone present. Purbright remained on his feet because the chairs had acquired allegiances. "I am grateful to you for coming," he said. Mr. Smeaton spent many years improving the wording of painful truths. His death has had the opposite effect. No one answered. Helena Grieve looked at Leonard Bell. He did not look back. "The chief assumption," Purbright went on, "has been that Mr. Smeaton was killed because of an old memorandum relating to money. It was logical and wrong. The old correction mattered because it concealed not fraud but parentage." Theo Bell's face did not change at once. Clara's hand moved towards her aunt and stopped. Mrs. Ember made a faint sound. Purbright continued in the same tone. "Laura Bell met Alistair Smeaton in 1949. Helena Grieve saw enough to understand there was danger to more than one household. Frederick Grieve suspected it later. Smeaton altered notes and softened records so that Laura Bell appeared merely indiscreet, not desperate. Leonard Bell knew before his marriage what difficulty he was marrying." Theo turned to his father. "You knew?" "Yes," said Leonard Bell. "Always?" "Yes." There it was, the long indecency, plain and almost quiet. Quillam shut his eyes briefly. Miss Peaslake looked tired. Theo gave a short laugh and sat down again because standing seemed too melodramatic. "Well," he said, "that is one way of being kind." "It was the only way your mother would accept," said Leonard Bell. Purbright let the words lie where they had fallen. Mrs. Bell wrote from Bath because she was dying and had become exact. She asked Helena Grieve to come, and before that she wrote to Theo. "Mr." Smeaton discovered that the old correction could no longer protect anyone. Mrs. Grieve wished the truth delayed until after she had seen Laura. Mr. Smeaton refused. Helena spoke for the first time. He was afraid Laura would die first and leave him carrying it alone. Purbright inclined his head. Yes. The room had reached the stage at which accuracy might be ruined by speech. Purbright turned to Mrs. Ember. "You moved the blue ledger first to protect Smeaton, then to protect Mrs. Grieve. You also followed her to the hall passage because you feared they would quarrel." Mrs. Ember clasped her gloves more tightly. "I only meant to see whether she was steady. And were you in time?" She looked at Helena, who gave the smallest nod. "I came up the side path," said Mrs. Ember. Mrs. Grieve was there already. Mr. Smeaton had his hat off and was speaking much too low. She said Theo must be told by his mother, or not at all. He said Laura had left it too late for delicacy. Then he said, "Mr." Bell had lived honorably with another man's burden, and there was no reason Theo should be spared humiliation if Leonard had not been. It was a vile thing to say. Leonard Bell did not stir. Theo looked at him, then away. Helena said, "I struck him." Quillam set down his cup. "With my hand," Helena went on, "across the face. He caught at my wrist, missed, stepped back against the bicycle, and fell. His head struck the bunker edge. It was absurd. That is what I remember most. How absurdly he looked at me, as if I had broken procedure." Purbright said, "You did not mean to kill him." "No." "Mrs. Ember reached you then?" "A moment later. She saw him on the ground. I thought he would rise and say something legal. When he did not, she took me away." Mrs. Ember's voice shook now, less from fear than from the fatigue of having been sensible too long. She could scarcely walk. I got her through the post office yard and told her to go home. When Dr. Fanshawe was sent for, I said nothing, because by then the village had begun listening. "The gloves," said Love softly. Mrs. Ember looked at her hands. "Mine. Suede. Miss Lark saw me, not Mrs. Grieve." The late shift moved through the room as relief. Miss Lark's unseen man dissolved into a careful widow. Helena's journey to Bath became postponement. Smeaton's death settled into its true shape, not murder planned, nor innocence struck by evil, but a collapse of tact after decades of it. Purbright said, "There will have to be statements. The law does not admire concealment, but neither need it pretend intention where there was none." Theo rose then, slowly, as if testing a new balance. He looked first at Helena, then at Leonard Bell. "My mother asked for me," he said. "I think I had better go to Bath." Leonard stood too. For a moment it seemed one of them might attempt sentiment, and the room, being English, prepared to suffer. Instead, Leonard only said, "If you wish, I will come as far as the station." Theo considered this as though it were an offer from a stranger with good references. "Yes," he said at last, "as far as the station." Mrs. Warrender, who had watched the proceedings with the composure of a woman seeing vulgarity finally taxed, rang for fresh tea. It was exactly the right thing, and almost unbearably so. Clara moved to her aunt. Quillam began discussing trains, because timetables are the clergy's last defense against tragedy. Mrs. Ember cried quietly, which improved her. Miss Peaslake looked at Purbright and said, "You have made it untidy again, Inspector." "No," he said, "only accurate." Outside, the light was going from the laurels, and the first lamps in the village were appearing one by one. Purbright took his hat from the hall table. Behind him, voices had resumed their civil levels. The settlement would not satisfy everybody. Such settlements never did, but it might allow them to continue. That, in villages, was often the nearest thing to justice.